Hello everyone, today we talk about the ethnic shift in the Roman army, a topic that somebody would call the barbarization of the same, and that, as you know, I'm violently opposed to as a concept, for many reasons that we will discuss today, but that I have also talked about in lots of videos. I really don't understand why I get so many views every time I make a video and then, nobody watches the old one. They are all inescapably and purposely interconnected, so if you listen to one and you don't follow the others, basically it doesn't make any sense for you to follow me in the first place. But we discussed the Roman army and the migration era and the passage from the Roman to the Germanic military system. So at least the most faithful followers know more or less what I'm talking about, at least in my terms. And it's actually a much more important topic that you may think, because the normal historiographical, say, attitude still, in fact, in the academy, is to consider, let's first of all say that everything is terribly complex and complicated, right? And therefore, let's sectorialize history to the point of still calling periods such as, the late Republic. The Roman Republic never existed as such institution in the modern sense of the term, even though the actual official name was Res Publica Populi Romani, but it didn't mean that in Latin, because, you can't simply transliterate and pretend that, meanings of 3 millennia old are basically the ones you pretend them to be. There is no such thing like, the early, the late Roman Empire. There's not even the Byzantine Roman Empire, even though I make videos explaining how useful and actually important it is to make the term Byzantine actually legitimate in terms of practical, for other reasons that are not exactly, in fact, this further sectorialization, but a broader reflection of the internal mechanisms of the Roman Empire. And the idea is, we have to look at the Roman army and how things change, and so we have just to fixate on one specific aspect of this community that is either military or political or social, and all finding our little biased interpretation from this narrower standpoint. Understanding the Roman Empire is understanding any other polity, as certain mechanisms are really universal. The Roman Empire is unique because history never repeats itself, not even a single damn time, for us to be always wary about what's coming next in an accurate way, not simply labeling stuff that we don't even understand, projecting our delusions on the past. And the Roman Empire is so overloaded with so many unavoidable cultural biases and misconceptions that fundamentally it's almost impossible to break the mold of what the general intellectual inertia of the masses actually think about this. So that when it comes also to the Roman army, everybody is an expert. As you know, I'm just a medievalist. As a military historian, I sometimes studied more ancient warfare than the medieval one at some point, and I have a great passion for Roman history and its deeper meaning in the history of Western civilization by ecumenic scale. That is yet another thing that people completely don't reason at all like, right? The best they do is thinking, the Roman Empire is like, it's like, the United States of the past, or the Nazi Germany of the past, depending on what kind of, ideology you want to project on it. And they were cool because they had technology, right? Look at how big this, empire looks on the map. And then if somebody, has to actually explain even the reason why Rome expanded, but in a broader sense, not just saying, the materialistic, mechanistic thing that doesn't actually explain anything, because there were plenty of more advanced peoples that didn't achieve at all what the Romans, as actually more primitives compared to the previous civilizations, actually did. And this is true also for later ones, for that matter. More of that coming about the Romano-Germanic synthesis and so on. That it's sometimes you realize the thing goes in circle, right? There is never a factual explanation. More or less, everybody has, at least of those who occupy very often exclusively of these things. There are various fashions. Usually, the more recent one in last generation was late Roman Empire, and also the Byzantine hyper-sensationalization, say, of the thing. So that there is this humus of people that kind of get the references but have no idea of how to put them together. Of course, in this video, I'm not going, because it's going to be brief in theory, at least I planned it to be, so you already know before me speaking now how long this is going to be. As I was saying before, first of all, there is an entire Roman history, Roman Empire playlist, so you can check that out. And I plan to talk more, actually, not just about Roman history, about ancient history in general in this kind of perspective. But there are some aspects of the so-called, in fact, barbarization of the Roman army that are actually key, right, in mostly dismantling, right? I hate to, always portray the thing as myth-busting, but some degree of, historical awareness does derive, importantly, from not a specific myth-busting, but from the comprehensive busting of what the idea, the prevalent idea of the lazy one, the unresearched, superficial, uncomprehensive one kind of is. And the reason why I oppose myself mostly to the concept of the barbarization of the Roman army is that as long as there was a Roman Empire, the army remained always Roman, right? There was never a moment in Roman history where the Roman element wasn't dominating within the army, right? And if this happened, it's because the Roman Empire ended, right? So it's that simple. While it is true, and this is the point, that the majority of so-called Roman soldiers were actually not Roman throughout all Roman history, right? Especially from, the times of the Romano-Italic Confederation onwards. Like, there was, numerically speaking, never a time in Roman history in which the majority of the army was made up by actual Roman citizens. Never, right? This was simply not the case. The thing changed over time, especially after the Constitution Antoninian, as far as we will see now, the realization that all people, and not all of them, actually, we talked about this in that video I made recently about Maximinus' tracts and the events of the war against Aquileia and so on, that should make us reflect. But in theory there is the passage also from Roman citizens to Roman subjects by a certain degree. Much of what we call Byzantine in a way was being formed, because also the shift, and as we have discussed very often also in Byzantine history videos, of the empire was going towards the east, and surprise, surprise, the western half was eventually taken over by other peoples, right? Now, at the end of the day, we're just practically ruling over Roman states themselves, and basically they Romanized, as also the modern countries speak Romance languages, and they would have not succeeded as such if they had not been ruling a Roman reality and they hadn't been absorbed by the same. And these areas remained the most advanced also throughout all the Middle Ages and so on. So it's a question of perspective in there. But already this concept, right, the fact that the majority of Roman troops was not Roman throughout all the empire, until this kind of nationalization of the army that we were discussing just the other day in the Roman strategy and foreign policy from Zeno to Justinian, that is exactly that, actually should make you understand that should acquaint you to the dimension of moral forces and moral superiority, and the same reason why the Roman army, the Roman Empire, actually had taken over the entire freaking world, and why this had been possible, essentially, and had been carried out by peoples that largely were not Roman, for the Romans to rule. and for these people to become Roman. So this is the most striking and actually unmatched feat of Roman civilization. No people in human history was ever able to do anything, even remotely close by scale, in relative terms, to what the Romans managed to do. That is to say, not just Romanizing an entire mass of people, also ethno-linguistically, fundamentally, for millennia to come, but to establish essentially the gold standard for any other possible imperial reality in the history of mankind. Right? You can't pick China and say, well, China did kind of no, because the Chinese were fundamentally concluded within themselves. Right? While it's true that initially China was something very vague conceptually, and probably there was something out there, including a possible Indo-European beginnings of the empire that we cannot demonstrate, but it wouldn't be really strange considering the dynamics also in the rest of Eurasia. It was essentially dominating on a set of populations that always kind of remained that, right? So, and that's cynicized because that was the environment. The Romans were essentially a Latin people, right? So this branch of the Latofaliscans within the Italic branch that, having created a polity, like a city, by Etruscan influence and basically controlling it, managed to Romanize basically anything that went from Scotland to the Persian Gulf in the span of a few centuries, fundamentally, and incredibly enough to maintain that kind of standard for any other ruler to come there, so that also all the Western-derived powers today basically have Roman symbolism figuring prominently and ostensibly, basically in all their institutional, coat of arms, etc. And this is it's just making it very simple and very secular and modern in terms, because of course everything gets down to what those peoples believed. But that's exactly the point. The Romans were the ones that went beyond any kind of sclerodization and hypostatization of power, simply said, we are the ones who will take over the world. The Romans knew that. They knew they were the chosen people. It was already present as an awareness, as the radical identity of the same Rome, how it was created, and fulfilling entirely the Indo-European and Mongolian. They simply took over the world and restored the Golden Age, and basically the sacredness of the same at that point kind of sclerotized. At that point was also filled by these other peoples, was that revived it at a certain point. This is a bit the history of the Ghibelline Middle Ages. There was a Roman Middle Ages, and in fact the actual decline of the Roman East, of Constantinople, that in spite of its actual constant decline, because it really was in perspective, if one looks at the very big scale, not just even in the expansional phases, what the world was doing around that, right? And in fact, what was also the West doing, that is a perspective that for some reason people don't like to hear, right? This entire concept of, say, universal imperial tradition as the core of basically any people in the past's identity, but also in specifically of the Western one, is practically entailing it. There are no such things like perspectives. In the moment in which you create perspectives, you deliberately decide that you need to cut a part of reality to essentially alienate yourself from it even more, right? All these videos, YouTube. Oh, let's look at this war from this people perspective, because that's perspective, because you didn't know that perspective, somebody fooled you, and so, or you want to embody those people so that you know their perspective, because it's that one that counts, and not the entire. I think this goes against, of course, any law of reciprocity, even just in the Clausewitzian theory, in understanding anything political or military, the idea that you cannot have perspectives in the sense of, let's pretend to study this thing as if the thing was not done by all the people involved together from both sides, right? So this is the weakening and the declining the putrescence of intellectual capacity nowadays, and of course of moral force. And this is the same reason why we don't have universal empires anymore, because essentially any power that exists out there is culturally inferior, not to be able to afford universal rule. And I always say this with great sympathy towards the actual greatest power in relative terms, so that the others are even more pathetic in a way until they actually are able to accomplish anything, which nowadays, especially, we're witnessing in a childlike fashion, that are absolutely will never be able. They're actually destroying themselves in the attempt, because simply, again, they cannot afford a cultural superiority. This is the problem of the entire humanity, essentially, because we have decided, again, to give up that broader, comprehensive idea and to completely renounce even to the acknowledgement that people in the past were obviously dramatically superior to us in everything. Right? Okay, let's skip this topic because otherwise I start digressing too much. But Romanity cannot be reduced to, again, a statalistic history, a militaristic history, not even an imperialistic history per se. Right? When we talk about the Roman army and the ethnic shift within it, it's a big thing. It does speak of the decline of the same Rome. This does speak in the unavoidable doom that, in again, any universal tradition was just said it will happen. Right? There was no people in the past who said, this has to actually last forever. There was always the idea that if you don't, if you don't spirit yourself, if you don't load yourself morally, if you don't go out there and do the thing, this system will collapse. And everybody was aware of the fact it would have collapsed at some point, right? So even the idea of the cyclicity of the world, in many ways, you have been told it's wrong, right? It pertains actually to the Chthonic dimension, was the one being ruled by Apollonian Uranic empires like Rome. And it's just a leftistic bias towards anything that belongs to that kind of cultistic, Demetric, Chthonic, Dionysian, even Pythagorean, kind of pre-Indo-European reality to say, okay, now the ancient world was not based on full-fledged virile dominance, militarism, authority, rationale, and discipline, and all these empires, those who made it, actually were about that. No, it was about, multiculturalism and tolerance and people just, mixing together and all this bullshit, which has nothing to do with any glimpse of factual history we get from any of the sources, any of the evidence, any of the entire historiography, because at the end of the day, these concepts were actually, what I'm saying, up to like 1 century ago, was, everybody said, yeah, like we know that, right? Today, you don't meet anyone who thinks this, because, again, it's a perspective that's being enforced from one side, and the other perspective is being removed. Right? And the most important thing that they don't want you to know is to have that comprehensive mindset, because if you get the comprehensive mindset, you will start ruling and dominating, right? And making things work. And in many ways, that's what we're witnessing, and I'm coming with lots of other content on this topic from a properly, history of religion point of view, dealing basically with a bit of everything, from paganism to Christianity and more. But when we look at the Roman army, in, say, imperial times, conventionally, what was happening is, of course, difficult to catch in the multiplicity of situations. Again, if you, of course, consider how big the Roman Empire was, and you start studying the details and the nuisances of every single province, you will say, well, but here happens this, and there happens that, and so you cannot generalize, but this is actually moral relativism. If you look at the empire as a whole, and given that this empire was factually controlled from a center, even though it was heavily decentralized in the practice of government, because it was just a pre-industrial society, this thing was dominated by a single people at some point that eventually pass control to others in some ways, by the way, which is not entirely true even, because, Italy, for example, was always central even in the West. Gaul was more important at some point, but it kind of crumbled. in perspective, that's not really the point. It's evident also for Constantinople, the reconquest of Rome herself, like in Justinian times, and the preservation of late antiquity up to that point, and more beyond that we see in the same Middle Ages. But again, it's the moral force that must be counted, and of course the moral force in absolute as well as in relative terms. Think about the Illyrian emperors, right? It's not that the Illyricum had a fortunate history of dramatic civilizational development all over. And part of the reason why it wouldn't have is also that it hadn't had historically up to that point. Unless you dig, in pre-Indo-European times, Bronze Age. Yes, I give you that. The Danube, the Middle Danube and Lower Danube were dramatically advanced, but there were another time, another story, and they had declined themselves, and because of the same Indo-European migrations. But let's say it's important, of course, and we see it in politics all the time. Like, if you are the strongest, you rule. Then if somebody, is not as strong as you, but can coalesce with somebody else, and together they are kind of, not stronger than you, but, enough to keep you at bay on some fronts, in some areas, etc., you kind of contain the thing. Well, this is what started happening in the late Roman Empire, roughly, right? And everything is really clear as a trend in the complex, right? It's like Byzantine history. There is no doubt it was a great civilization, that it had great expansionistic phases that achieved pretty remarkable feats, but if you consider what was happening outside of it at that point, already the fact that it was an outside was the problem for an ecumenic rule. Because what's outside an ecumenic rule? Ecumenic means you control the entire world. What's out there was something else. We're starting to be something else. So again, this ratio strength that is always mobile, it's always changing, etc., but takes also some specific characters that are reflected by the military changes and the barbarization, you want to call, of the Roman army. As we will see, maybe it's too big of a word, and it's probably incorrect in many ways, both formally and also approximately. But as we were saying before, what Romans did actually was to expand in other regions, right, subjugating other peoples that were absorbed by the same Rome, right? Romanity, of course, was a matter of religious and military identity, right? Rome was, again, the leading power. We had, per se, the force to subjugate and Romanize and convince, right, of the worthiness of their cause, lots of peoples that kept the empire expanding. This is the entire history of Rome. I mean, if it had depended on the oligarchy that wanted was too reactionary, didn't want to extend citizenship, etc., Rome would have never come out of Latium, right? But this wouldn't happen because this was the point. The purpose entirely was great enough, right? It was convincing enough, and the leadership was, in fact, qualitative enough to be able simply to exert that dominion. If you don't have the decisive moral support of the population, you cannot rule, ever, right? Always remember this. Every totalitarian regime existed because the people under it made it happen, right? By acting, by not acting, right? It's obvious that totalitarianisms emerge in the most culturally underdeveloped peoples and countries and cultures because those people are that weak morally to let this thing happen, not to revolt. And this is, in fact, also a hallmark of Western civilization in many ways, that rejected that, and the same Romanity was strongly substantiated exactly by this alliance, by this societas, the Soci, the Roman army that, made it happen, right? Rome, again, owed more to the non-Romans for its expansion than the same Romans. That surely held the power, but brought the others also to fight in their stead, right? And this, again, entailed a provincialization of the army because, of course, there was a munus. There was properly a remuneration, an incentive for people to fight and die for Rome in exchange of Roman citizenry. So the absolute freedom of the world conquerors, right? And this entailed an immortal transfiguration. A true Roman, fundamentally, if he is virtuous, and he has fulfilled his task, religiously and military, will transfigurate, will be able to. This is the Evangelion, and that's also why Christianity strongly militarized and Romanized in order to expand herself in the Roman Empire, buying this entire concept that was already present actually in the Judaic tradition with different characteristics, but again, it was the same universal religion believed in the completely identical way, in the universal fashion. And the point was obvious. Of course, the imperator, the princeps, later on specifically, was the medium with the divinity and the one who would eventually actually transfigurate and become divine. But the Romans could comparticipate to this, right? And so elevating themselves to a status that would essentially bring them to heaven in the beyond, right? Whereas the other masses that were just, ruled over were, in a sense, perceived in that decadent fashion that was based on the same passivity for which they had been defeated by Rome. Think about Greece, that was surely a hell of a power. I mean, speaking in broader terms, the Hellenistic kingdoms, etc. Rome, who were the Romans? Were just basically Romano-Italic peasants, right? Warriors, etc. They took over again the world from relative nothingness. And if you don't account moral force in this, not even all the Italian material resources that were quite potentially abundant would explain the thing per se, because there were, again, much richer powers also elsewhere, right? This is a matter, again, it's not a mechanic process, right, that you can mathematicize, etc. This is literally human beings taking over other human beings, right? It entails the concept of properly of domination and subjugation. You can argue that the Roman Empire was the manumission, right, of the conquered, right? This was, present among the Germans during the migration era. The idea of elevating to the status of freemen, so this kind of nobility, because it entailed the sacred right and duty to bear arms that stood behind the entire Romanity, but also this traditional cultures all over, including the ones the Romans took over. Also the slaves, of also peoples that were not, essentially, that they had been subjugated, and as such they were considered as inferior. But this was the greatness of Rome in the way that no other people really achieved in the same way up to that point. The capacity of, in fact, elevating the conquered at the level of the conquerors, right? Which was the greatest achievement ever for throughout all the, because it could afford that infinite manpower, right? Made up by people who were redeemed by this action, right? That's why I say the Evangelion, because the entire Augustine religion is basically the same one of the Gospels. And that's yet another thing that people don't really realize, because the Gospels are basically deriving from the same Indo-European background of universal tradition in general that even the Semites had, everybody had. So this kind of redemption made Rome, whereas the Greeks would say, no, I'm too snob, I will never give the citizenship to, some other people that maybe live 30 kilometers away from me. No, that's just mine, right? But it's also not so simple, meaning that there was properly a certain lifestyle, an idea, and an understanding that cannot be in fact, just concluded in a formula that makes some people's changing course as well. I made a video about the moral superiority of the Roman civilization, in which I explained fundamentally how the Romans did this, largely at least from what we know in archaic times, but also up to the Augustan era, because it's not to be given for granted at all. And materialism doesn't explain anything. On the contrary, the entire Roman religion was based on anti-materialism. Like, basically, again, all the traditional ones were at the time. Again, we will talk more about this, but it's important to stress and repeat ad nauseam, because if one doesn't get this point, basically, we can go confidently as far as saying that you cannot understand anything historical, right? You can even be, the top professor, whatever. You will not have basically understood anything. You will have just lost yourself in some sort of secularistic, modernistic hyper-specialization that will have just narrowed your mind down in a kind of contemplative way, and not having understood the meaning that all traditional cultures actually owned, and that was pretty common knowledge up to a few hundreds of years ago for us today, instead disgustingly neglect. So the provincialization entailed an internal process, like the idea that the empire was made up of provinces that the Romans had, in fact, ruled through their imperium. As you know, the great turning point, at least in this broader sense of the barbarization, intended, as we'll say again, in a very improper way, considering exactly this prodrome, because again, weren't like the Gallic legionnaires of the first century AD that were like 30% of the Roman army. Even though some of them were surely, sons of, Italic colonists, etc., but others did come from the Celtic background. Weren't they barbarians? Like, wasn't half of the army made up by auxilia that were, in fact, by definition, belonging to these other peoples that were not Roman and largely properly from the most what we call barbaric, which the Romans didn't quite intend in the same way the Greeks did. And in fact, this idea of the barbarization is also a little biased from the Hellenizing historiography of the late empire that, from a Romano-Italic perspective, actually had kind of other ideas regarding the thing per se, slightly different, right? I'm not saying that it was alien from it, but as you know, that's the point. It's exactly because the Roman Empire was different within itself that Rome holding it together was the great feat of this all. So the main problem we have is considering the idea of borders, right? As if, again, as we were saying before, an ecumenic empire could have borders. The ancient peoples didn't reason like that. Of course, it was a material practicality that could not be denied. The Romans did fortify their frontier. They had an idea of more or less who was from this side and the other side. But it was a very vague concept. Also because the importance was not really the territory per se, but the people that inhabited it. Maybe a subtle difference, but this is also crucial because we have been habituated to look at world maps that, aside from the just properly the graphicization of the territorial extension that substantiates the same idea of what you think, like, I don't know, on the map Spain or Poland or China or whatever. It's that border, it's that color, it's that boundary, right? That they didn't have any of that. The Romans had some kind of itineraria, rather. That is to say, they just needed to know where to go when they had to, to go subjugate another people, where to pass from. And still today, actually, and that's the reverse of that materialism, determinism, and relativism brought in the fashion, countries exist because people there exist with an idea of themselves, which is ever-changing, and albeit containing some important continuity with the past, much greater than you can think. Like, peoples are absolutely maintaining certain characteristics from centuries or even millennia ago, right, still today. And the world changes ever faster, but up to a certain point, at this point we are at the end of a great expansional phase, so things will also kind of slow down, and probably also sclerotize in a kind of cultural identity fashion, much more than we think. And the same, there can be a nationalization of culture and identity also from allogeneic elements. The same thing that the Romans in part did, considering again that, I don't know, Spain or Gaul began to speak Romance languages historically, even though they weren't even, Italic in nature, and so on. This thing did happen as well. It was also a way for the Romans to control, but it happened just osmotically in a natural way, right? Also because the elites that kept ruling, especially in France and in Spain, were the ones that had the greatest political and social continuity with Roman times. And that's the single most important thing that you have to think. If you wonder why and how that was, well, it was also because of that, right? And I'm not going to digress even on more, history of languages, but there is a very, again, interesting consideration about who is that rules that make the thing happen. And it's not just mere enforcement. It's just, a hierarchical cultural domination of the superior ones that is obviously the most advanced model to follow, because it's just more comprehensive and it embodies by itself the rule, the functionality of the rule itself. So what we see, however, is that by the 3rd century, 4th century, an ever greater amount of peoples comes in, knocks at this Roman frontiers, and the Romans actually were already habituated to get people in, not in by the scale. It started happening especially from the 4th century onwards with the domino effect caused in Eurasia by the Hunnic migrations. That also shifted the balance, also ethnically, importantly, in the army, for reasons we will explain now. But they had already been habituated, again, to consider the idea of dominating these peoples, whichever they were. And up to Adrianople, and arguably also after that by an important scale, it kept happening, because it was the absolute normality, right? Especially deporting peoples that had been defeated to become the next recruits for the army, the next farmers for the fields, etc. Because it was very profitable, especially in an era where things were contracting, where evidently that great, powerful drive had been exhausted itself, because exactly through the provincialization of the army, eventually the most warlike elements that could be co-opted within the Roman army were gentrifying, right? And so they had been fighting and dying for Rome because they wanted to live as Romans, wanted their children to have that higher standard that was obviously the only point of the whole thing. The same federati in practice did this, right? There is a huge divide between, the Germans and, say, the Huns in the kind of range of ideas and possibilities that they had regarding settling Roman territory. The Germans were already heavily Romanized. Peoples like the Huns could have never dominated the empire, could have best exacted these tributes by dwelling at its frontiers, but they didn't have any consistencies. They collapsed as they had formed. The Germans integrated in the fabric of Roman society. They created the Romano-Germanic kingdoms. They were importantly Latinized in administrative legal culture. They essentially kept governing the same structures that had remained from Roman times and blended in with this unique synthesis. This is true also for other ethnicities, telling you the truth, but at least the Germans are the ones that, in this idea of moral force, have rightly stood on the fore, because they managed to accomplish that synthesis in a way that lasted for to this day, right? Because again, as I always say, the Latin Germanic identity is at the end of the day the same root of Western civilization as we intended. The others were essentially westernized by that, or westernized ex novo from that, meaning that, as the Romans had kind of integrated the Germans, creating altogether the Romano-Germanic reality, what also great areas of Central Europe, of Eastern Europe, kind of westernized. That is to say, they de facto were influenced by either the Western Renaissance modern states, liberal democracies that entailed that same concept that the Romans had employed, in fact, that people today, very superficially kind of regard as either a pro or con, but again, exactly in that sense, they don't understand what makes the thing done. The people think that it's just the forms of government are good or bad on the base of, of themselves. They sclerotize, they alienate, they look somewhere else, right? The form of governments that work are the ones that manage to actually expand, to increase life, to improve its quality, and so on. So it's quite easy in the various times in history which civilizations were the superiors and the others weren't, right? It's that easy to understand, right? So you cannot hate democracy today when you look at, the people who live in democracies are by far the ones with the highest standards of living and liberty and intelligence and education compared to others that, are still, they still have to understand where to begin with that in order to be functional, right? So it may be that there is a time which these so-called democratic countries will collapse because that system will not sustain itself. And at that point, the things will be bad enough for the world entire to maybe say, okay, the more autocratic power will be superior, but we're definitely not even remotely inside of that. Doesn't matter how aggressive certain autocratic powers are, they're just shit, fundamentally. They're just historically, culturally, morally. They just don't work. They never made things work, and that's the reason why they are the way they are. That's why understanding history in perspective is so important. You cannot alienate yourself pretending that your country is special because it's yours. No, chances are that your country, generally speaking, is trash anyway, and it should deserve much worse because of the shit that you essentially embody. But of course, there is a hierarchy of values that you cannot fool in relative terms. You cannot say, but in that country, it's. Let's forget it's dramatically more advanced in anything, but there, something, I spot that thing that is bad, so mine is special. No, if it's a sewer, it doesn't work like that, right? You're just, again, a paranoid, an alienated. You're basically the embodiment of that Chthonic, Dionysian, Telluric cults that the Uranic empires dominated, basically till to this day, because if you are in that situation, it's because somebody else dominates by far than you. So more than you, so that's the point that one must make, right? And the same goes for the migration era, right? It's not that the Germanic peoples were dramatically advanced, or once they settled, like in the Roman territory, they were florid and happy, and no, they were undergoing the same dramatic problems the Romans were doing in terms of shortage of manpower, of resources. It took centuries before these conglomerations managed to develop further into something more advanced than what the peak of classical civilization had been. This is true for most of the Middle Ages, by the way, so I'm not saying that, again, you have to wait for the Enlightenment. That's the other liberal myth, that everything started from. No, the High Middle Ages started to be easily way more advanced than classical times, by themselves. And again, they do derive from this very intense, deep working process that these peoples had to do, right? And the alchemy of it is very delicate and peculiar, not to be given for granted. It's just not, again, you put all peoples in that condition to will actually do it. No, right? First of all, you can't do that, but still, peoples are different, right? They come to differ exactly in that way, and history can easily take different turns. But that hierarchy is crucial, right, as well. So it's obvious that if this prosper empire starts to decline at some point, start to contract, or at least to be destabilized by problems, that bear in mind, every time they tell you why did the Roman Empire collapse, decline, everybody, we have to go look at monetary policy, we have to think about socio-economical issues, what kind of mechanism happened. Have you ever thought there may be something like that an empire based on the idea of absolute struggle and victory, based as the entire sole purpose of mankind, by being defeated, for example, at some point will be deeply undermined from a moral point of view? This happens to everyone in many ways. Everybody gets defeated sometimes, but let's say the problems that began to affect the empire, of course, were a mix of many causes, including material ones. There is no doubt about that. But that when you start looking at things in perspective, do not look so even. Like, what about matter, right? Is matter something that you exhaust at some point just per se, and or that there are some, precious metals can get exhausted, some veins can be fully exploited, etc. But the idea is, does that explain, like, the thing is worth just matter? Of course not. It's about what people make for it and what else they can find. Right? Europe went on exploiting its own resources by magnitudinal scale for centuries, more than anything that could be possible, because of ancient technology. And of course, ancient technology was limited in that as well to provide with new solutions. But, the resources were still there, and largely speaking, the continent began to re-expand also, again, in high medieval times, where basically technology was the same, the one of the ancient world, right? But they had apparently stronger forces from a demographic, from agricultural point of view. How did that happen? Of course, there is a moral dimension to it, right? And this is based mostly on politics, right? Politics is basically the single most important thing if you look at it. And it's obvious that if, in order to defend yourself, you have to rely increasingly on elements that you don't have the capacity of stemming, especially at the local level, in a very wide empire that has this internal readjustments, etc., you will start to look at things in a different perspective. Like, there is this guy's pressuring on the border. I'm living in a decentralized area where still I've always been living like that. Why would I care so much for the central government at this point, where everybody is kind of, also like in terms of this process of broader participation to the empire. Think about after the Edict of Caracalla. And why shouldn't they profit from this, right? The idea of simply having to keep the empire together, right, didn't begin to come apart because, there were barbarians invading. Those were influent. If you just look at the numbers of the Roman army, but they didn't mean anything. Not even the defeat of Adrianople was anything consistent. A generation after Adrianople, the Roman army could deploy an army of the same strength to one they had lost in that battle, and to defeat the greatest possible enemy that a Roman army could find on the field. That is, another Roman army that was recruited by the same Romans somewhere else in the empire. So you immediately understand, also considering the story of the Visigoths that were crushed by Stilicho repeatedly, and every time, like cat and mouse, right? Stilicho decided just to save the Visigoths, that he could simply and literally exterminate for using them as political pawns. That the entire, again, picture of this thing had to finish in that way, or there was just this kind of red blob on Eurasia and the Mediterranean that we call Roman Empire, actually depends on those people, on those choices, on that sense of how much they believe in that thing. The Western half basically dissolved itself, probably because of also this same dynamic, and especially what's the the opportunities deriving from autonomization, even from Constantinople at some point, could actually entail for the populations, right? This is yet another more migration here and also post-Roman topic, and I made, as you know, lots of videos about this specifically, and there is a very peculiar dynamic there that I'm referring to that is, in fact, is also historiographically recognized about that dynamic. So, just another simple element, the so-called barbarization that occurred through the solid, massive immixtion of, say, beyond frontiers peoples. So people coming from the Barbaricum and hence called barbarians, but not quite, again, in the anti-Roman slogans. People say, oh, they call them barbarians. There are all these people shocked and hypocritically because they just are racist, fundamentally have some issues still with ethno-nationalism and 19th century social Darwinism regarding who were the peoples 2,000 years before in the countries where they lived, or they were, they were in the Roman Empire. They think they're the same people. I mean, this kind of underschooled trash. But I'm actually referring to the fact that the Romans didn't have at all, and their entire history proves that, a specific anti-barbarian hatred, right? It was a much more ferocious thing in the eastern half of the empire, where the Greeks had always had this kind of more xenophobic contempt towards the outsider, right? And the Byzantine culture in many ways does embody that, even if you look at properly the centers of power that should never be forgotten. Also considering properly the difference of the eastern provinces with the western ones and how they worked. But this barbarization, let's say, that practically meant relying on allied groups that were settled from within the frontiers in areas that, however, were lost from direct Roman control in the process, actually presented itself not much in the comitatenses, so in the actual field armies of the empire, that were ever more connected to this, the more, in fact, Mediterranean areas, that there had been a broader reform, as you know, during Diocletian and Constantine's times, regarding also an important centralization of resources for the armies that before were mostly settled on the frontiers, and whereas they were coming back, and not much even because of the barbarians only, but also because of the various provincial usurpers, the same Romans. And in fact, when you look at the Comitatenses, you see there is an extraordinary civilizational military standard, right? I made a video, and this is notorious to anyone who has any minimal, military historical expertise about the late Roman army. The Constantinian army was by far the single most advanced and tactically effective army that Rome had ever fielded. Right, it defeated enemies that had been far worse than the former Romans had ever seen. In many ways, most of the barbarization was reflected within the Limitanae, right? That weren't that bad troops either, telling the truth, right? They were sometimes even better equipped, or as well as equipped as the Comitatenses. A bit of a prejudice regarding that. And the obvious reason being the fact that the barbarians were mostly settled along the frontier, so with the same limes that was not even used as a term at the time. The Romans considered this broader military deployment at the frontiers as munimenta, that is, some ammunition, let's say literally, to rule, by the way, peoples from both sides. Right, like it's not that it was a Rhine frontier, Danubian frontier, and the legions settled there were just shielding all the fully Romans from within the empire from the terrible outside barbarian aggressors. No, they were actually a massive deterrent force, keeping at bay peoples living from both sides. right? And in fact, the entire point of this Federati settlement was to recreate various layers of, let's say, of defense against other groups that wanted to push. And this worked fine enough because, the barbarians kind of settled in more advanced places, were kind of okay with that. That's what they wanted, even though these places mostly were deserted at some point by the same Romans, so they were not even particularly meaningful anymore from an economical point of view. But we're still kind of better than the Barbaricum. There was objectively something else, and they wanted to defend this land, right? There were other peoples like them that they also knew somewhat better than the Romans, that also, however, knew them well enough, that pushed, and they would stay there and kind of defend those lines themselves from these other peoples. Also, these frontier areas were depopulated, importantly, so there was enough room for these peoples as well. In other cases, like with the Visigoths in Aquitaine after Adrianople, the Sacred Rome, etc., what you have is basically this people in arms substitutes itself to the actual field army, right? They get the annona supplies as the local army that doesn't exist anymore did, so they simply settled there. They got 1/3 of the land, but not quite literally the land, but again 1/3 of the annona that equated to those natural resources. There was enough room for anyone, arguably. There were surely lands confiscations, distractions, really a few, because it would have not made sense for them as well. But yeah, surely the people who inhabited there were not happy to see now barbarians dominating them. But still, again, these barbarians were very often already Romanized. The Visigoths had paid a dramatic blood tribute for Rome. They had been fighting on the various frontiers, and even though they were the most massive ethnic problem at a given moment for the Romans to dilute, like even in the Roman army, and mostly in the eastern frontiers where they had been developed, they never surpassed like a 30% of the entire army. So barbarization, in my eyes, eventually they were diluted as well, etc. Of course, there was a broader process of, say, barbarization in the measure in which, naturally, these peoples kept living within the empire, and so they mixed with the Roman population. They kind of course, brought their own culture, their own creed, beliefs, etc. But they were still doing it as Romans. When you look at this think about Stilicho, these people that were just, they had parents that, one of the parents that had been born in the Barbaricum itself, but they were true Roman servants, politically, militarily. Why? Because, of course, the Roman Empire was the thing that would provide you with most power to rule and control. And it would have made no sense to destroy it, but just to partake in it as long as it worked. I mean, even Attila, as we were saying before, the Huns weren't, particularly civilized, let's put it in these terms. But, the point of Attila was not destroying the empire at all. We would have paid tributes to him if, it hadn't been the empire with a fiscal system working. Instead, you want to, a bunch of federati like you use, and they're always quarreling with each other, and, they're quite a problem to mobilize, etc. Depend just on the deterrent that you can offer. Do you want just, kind of an empire that says, okay, well, let's not come to arms because, it costs too much, or we'll pay you money to stay at bay, etc. And guess what happened to the Hunnic Empire, right? It simply disappeared from the face of the earth. The Roman Empire went on for another millennium. So, it's not so dramatic as it seems, right? The times were dramatic, but not in this kind of ethnic shift, right? And this was done, again, settling peoples in even some of the most Romanized lands was normal. For example, there were Swabians and Sarmatians in northern Italy, settled to defend the frontiers, the Alpine passes. These are people that, do not exist, cannot be traced anymore ethnically. I don't know if you look at the Italian background, etc. But you know that there were, and that they contributed to form it in the same ways. Just, again, we can't distinguish it anymore, but it happened since that time. And again, the same lands were very diverse. For example, Cisalpine Gaul, this one, it was part of Italy from an administrative point of view, but let's say it was, late Roman times, quite detached from the Mediterranean circuits. Like, Italy was really like the central and southern peninsula, and they had much more in common, say, with Provence, with the Provincia, that than with Cisalpine Gaul, right? Or northern Italy at that point. So it's all very vague. And also, who did rule, right? If you were an average Roman subject, you would have been just a colonist under some big landowner, but really big landowner, meaning that this guy had his family had the control on enormous latifundia scattered all over, I don't know, Italy, Africa, whatever, and you simply couldn't do anything about that. What did you actually hear, unless some barbarian came to loot those same latifundia where you lived in, about even who ruled, right? And especially if the Romans were fighting each other, as they often did, wouldn't have you preferred maybe the stability provided by a barbarian leader at some point? Because this is exactly what I was talking about before. It's what normally was written in Gaul, in Spain, in Italy, after the Germanic people settled and maintained some order and stability, because they were a unitary power based on the pre-existing administration and kind of making things work, and people were okay with that, largely. And that's what kind of most people really want. They want that authority, power, order. That's the unescapable precondition for any other possible development, right? And individual liberty was not even actually lower under the Germans later on, and they had been under the late Roman times. That's the reason, again, as we've seen, in deeply Romanized areas like Italy, etc., most locals actually sided, let's say, with the Ostrogoths. Think about Totila, that freed the colonists by saying also to the serf, you will be free if you fight for us. Do you want to be under a Byzantine latifundium? Right now, from somebody that comes from, I don't know, from Constantinople, that was a foreigner at that time. So also Romanity changes in a sense. Well, these are the same lands, and broadly speaking, in the West, where just 300 years later, a new Roman Empire would have been founded, by the way, right? So I hope we will be making lots of other videos about what this ethnic shift and blending actually entailed. Because if you look at the various units, they varied often in language, race, arms, insignia, field, like military deities, that in many ways, the latter being similar, but just like the language or the race, or even the arms and the symbols, etc., they were all, broadly speaking, part of this universal, mostly, especially speaking of Europe, Indo-European background. The languages were similar. They had always been, and also it was kind of normal to be multilingual at that point by a certain degree, especially in the army. There were peoples, again, that went to fight in the Roman army from outside the limes, let's put it in this way, inappropriately enough, fighting for the Roman army, and coming back home and at discharge beyond the limes. There are Danish burials witnessing this, and of course some of these people would be the same ones that came to loot and raid within the empire, but the existing of this community between people that even said, what's your job? Well, I went fighting for the Roman army for 20 years. And also maybe putting my experience at service of local ruler later on, etc., and providing my family with some greater opportunities here, etc. It was a thing. It was not. There was a big divide it is true between the Barbaricum and the civilized world. I mean, let's be honest about this. But it's not because these cultures were so distant from each other, right? They were different in that form of hierarchical organization, where the Mediterranean regions simply were more prosper. They allowed more surplus. It was a state, right? It was a bureaucracy. It was a permanent army, right? In many ways, of course, think about the Germans. Those were peoples in arms, and again, for the tribal confederacies, it was normal pretty much everywhere. This was true also in North Africa. It was true for most of the Middle East as well. Arabia, not talking about the steppes. But it was also about finally living in a more relaxed way, not having to fight all the time, but to finally win control over these resources. And all these symbolisms and ideas and beliefs actually being part of the same. The idea, again, was participating the empire, and specifically the Roman Empire at that point. Because even though all these peoples were didn't feel themselves inferior to the Romans, but they had been for a long time, and so they were able to realize who was under whom, and the fact that they were also getting the upper hand locally at some levels, and so this emboldened them. But the awareness that there was a massive superpower capable of mobilizing an atrocious amount of military power, that had this, lived in cities with walls, with aqueducts, with a fleet, with a hell of a logistics, with roads, paved roads, like this. You cannot but gravitate around this, right? And you know that as a medievalist, talking about the early Middle Ages and beyond, not just about the coming back of the term of Roman Empire formally as some kind of legalist would like to make you think, no, but the Carolingian Empire wasn't Roman. No, these people still believed that the Romanity of the empire had been something too great not to be always at the center of the point of the situation of all of it. There was some kind of jealousy and right, let's say property right in a sense of that kind of Romanity, which was based also on this ethnic proximity. That's again why also the Latin Germanic world kind of became antagonistic with the Byzantine one, and vice versa, of course, because that was a past they had in common at that point with some power and imperial ideology that was different culturally from the one of Constantinople at the end of the day. Yes, the universal idea was the same, but the way to it was different, and that's the point. In those times, if you had power, you simply had it, and you had demonstrated your righteousness. That's what basically all peoples really believed, right? And even don't think that Christianity in this sense is actually not more subtle than it seems, because that kind of, again, hypostatic idea that it's just about you accepting something and believing enough to be saved, of course, it's nonsense. For not talking about just the idea of some random predestination per se, of what that is also a dramatic sclerotization of the idea. The works were everything, and everybody understood that because they looked at real power, not at some strange abstractions of it. That's why you couldn't avoid to deny Rome. So there was this different type of recruitment, of course, depending on, for example, local conscription deployed to the defense of the limes. Also, the kind of more national recruitment for the special units. And I'm talking about these federati ones, right? The ability of which in a particular type of exercise was connected, in fact, to the ethnic tradition of a natio or natio, um, were summed in part, right? They, especially to increase the impression of this cosmopolitic blend offered by the late Roman army. But it was functional to itself. After all, this is very simple. I don't know. What was the best cavalry considered? Like, mostly in the light skirmishing type, the Moorish one. Now, what was special about that, technically or anything? Nothing. These were just literally guys on horseback with javelins. Point. Like, did Europe ever lack this kind of unit? No. But that through that kind of gentrification we were talking about, who were the peoples that were kind of more convenient in cost-benefit ratio to hire without having to spend too much for their training and even armament and recruiting, even though that still happened. Of course, let's pick these Moors from the Atlas Mountains that are already hyper-skilled because their entire life is spent literally on horseback, raping, killing, doing it, and they're the best at it. They just have the mindset on it. They just know how to fight. You pick, an average Roman colonist from one of those big latifunias, still have to provide with, a certain amount of capital for the army, but that, just know how to plow the land. Yes, of course, the Roman army was capable simply of, destroying you as a human being or reforming you as a killing machine that wouldn't consider any form of human, feeling anymore. But it costed. So even though it was very effective, and the comitatenses were basically this, if you needed effective light cavalry, you just picked these guys from the Atlas Mountains that also, lived in their own, better if I don't say what, but that for that amount of money, we'll do the thing, right? And this was the mechanism that had always happened, right? Again, you cannot say, well, in the early empire, this was not true. False. This had started with the numeri since ever. Like, people's drawn from... Again, even in the Republic, what do you think, like, that a Picenian, countryman really was in the Apenninic heartland? Like, they were barbarian warriors, fundamentally. This had always been the freaking thing. The Moorish Cavalry is to be found since the late Republic. And you keep finding it in the late Roman Empire. At centuries, half a millennium distance, which, by the way, tells you also that, again, those guys from the Atlas Mountains or somewhere else, or even from within the same empire, think about the Illyrians at some level, the Isaurians, had remained pretty much the same. Because really the resources, the development, etc., was, in the Mediterranean area along the coast, the urbanized areas, the rich valleys, these guys detached, they just had kept existing without too much trouble. This was true for many people. Think about the Bagaudae in Gaul, in Spain. Think about the Sarkenoi in Sinai. These were Semitic peoples that, again, from which also the term Saracen would, in a classicizing terminology, would come from, and they had always been dwelling next to. Think about the Arabs, in fact. Right? The Arabs had seen everything. The Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Persians, Alexander. What had they remained? And literally up to the 20th century, just essentially a bunch of Bedouins. Right? The same Islamic Empire was made up by, Arabicized elites with essentially other peoples that had nothing to do with the Arabs. So, again, the aforementioned mechanism, who does have to win and what, right? So, the numeric were very varied also, as you know, that they counted infantry, cavalry, or also mixed units. They had always been recruited from within the most marginal peoples of the empire, or at this point among the Federati, that again were also so numerous because they were moving en masse, right? Literally migrating in hundreds of thousands of people that entered the empire. And so, well, at that point, you could have not avoided recruiting them, even if you had not wanted it, right? First of all, it was convenient for both of them, because also the Federati, as you know, got in the process some degree of legitimization for settling Roman land and providing with these troops in exchange, etc. But they were pretty big and large, and they were just moving within the empire. Some were stamped, some were cut down, some were redeployed, some broke through and were not diluted and were to stay and to eventually rule in the lands of the Western Empire later on. It's very likely that the numeri, especially, that were regulated in role and organization by Hadrian, importantly already, responded to the urgent need to increase within the Roman army the number of the contingents by this kind of characterized by the most differently armed national specialties, such as, for example, the bow, right, or disposing of more mobile troops because lightly equipped and capable of fighting against the enemy, also in a condition of parity. Again, given that these were mostly marginal peoples, they often lived themselves close to the frontier, and so they knew already how to fight traditionally against some other people. This had been an important issue. We also made a video about, for example, the so-called Levantine Roman archer auxilia, that for some reason everybody thinks the Romans had the Syrian archers, but there doesn't seem to be any specific evidence of the fact that that specific equipment with the conic helmet and the scale armor was necessarily or only specifically Syrian. Like basically the entire Middle East and the Western Eurasian steppes had the same kind of equipment. There might have been even Balkan troops as far as we are concerned. But the point is that they came, like the aforementioned gentrification of these populations in the long run made them lose that traditional skill and capacity. Think about, I don't know, the Balearic or Rhodian slingers or Cretan archers. Why were these peoples famous for those specialties? There was plenty of slingers or archers everywhere. Well, maybe because these had made of their traditional lifestyle, like shepherds, etc., business, right? Because they were in the center of the Mediterranean, were more easily at hand than some peoples in the hinterland, and so they had become more famous. But gradually, these peoples had also civilized somewhat, not entirely, because again, even the islands very often remain isolated. Surprise, surprise. Thinking even in medieval times, how, I don't know, the Venetian colonists would fought with knights, etc., and the Cretan troops from the countryside were still kind of wild, right? And so this is again always a bit the same problem we were saying before. Some of these peoples had remained kind of a bit like they had always been, but at some point, and in also for other mechanisms that we don't fully grasp or understand, and sometimes it's just the sources we lack that give us a falsified impression, at some point disappear as military specialists, because probably they had those conditions, those business conditions for which they would have offered that specialty were simply disappearing, right? So there was also, in a sense, a rebarbarization of some areas in Europe, but generally speaking, in early medieval times, we witness a proto-feudal society where the leaders disarm the populace, so that you don't find, for example, a big deal of, I don't know, slingers in medieval times. We know they were there. We know that, especially in areas like the Celtic fringe, for example, in Britain. And why do you think it's the case? We were talking about it the other day with the Welsh infantry video we made. These had remained isolated and more warlike, right? Some Scottish Highlanders went to battle still in the 17th century with a medieval equipment. Why? Because in their places they were just okay with that. Like, they didn't need more, right? And they were also skilled with other weapons. It's just that very often either they couldn't afford them or en masse, so they, for local warfare, there were other mechanisms, other preferences. So the ethnic shift within the Roman army entails also an actual Romanization, so a disappearance of those older kind of barbarian specialties. And that's the narrative I was talking about before. Why wouldn't be considered like, a barbaric army, I don't know, the Polybian one, where the majority of troops were Italic and not Roman? I mean, the Romans were Italic, but you know what I mean, politically speaking, right? Those were not full Roman citizens. Why were, I don't know, think about all, again, the auxilia, the early imperial auxilia. They were all, like, half of the army and more barbarians. Also the ethnic, the allied contingents for other peoples, etc. Why wasn't the barbarization there making an impact? At the end of the day, why was the Roman army remaining Roman institution and everything, and, just in the later Roman Empire, and just in some areas of the empire, the Federati take over? It's evidently not a problem of barbarization at all. If anything, that proves that the Roman army had Romanized the barbarians. At some point, the Roman army disappears because a Roman state disappears. And that has surely to do with the barbarian contribution. There's no doubt. Again, that different model and mindset they offered at some level in a contracting world, in difficult times, have evils, disasters, resources that could not be replenished like before, well, would change things. But it was, again, a matter of the same Romans that decided that that was kind of the better option, right? Because, again, you cannot rule on a land if you don't have the decisive moral forces of the population. It's true, again, that the moral force of the population had waned because also of that loss of military protagonism. Because, again, it was normal for an archaic Roman to be proud of bearing arms that made him a noble and partially sacred himself, because he had the Imperium. Late Roman colonists didn't even kind of think like in those terms anymore. They lived within a completely different mindset. Not because their elites had lost actually the archaic one, they still maintained it. Everybody did. It's just that they had felt in that condition because they had kind of renounced on the longer run, like today, while our liberties are eroded, and we say, well, okay, what's the difference it's going to make? It makes a huge difference, right? And it doesn't make a huge difference because, you're a poor victim. It's because it's your fault, right? So that's also why you can't just pretend to complain about your government, but still living the way you do, right? Because all the populism that we see is exactly this. People that are basically doing nothing, but being passive-aggressive on the internet to vent their own personal frustrations because they know they're not enough. They don't have an actual power. They will never go out there and do something about the whole thing. They will not make a relevant effort. They will just think about their miserable life that is ever narrower in boundaries, and that's what happens. And this dynamic was happening actually within the same Federati, which we tend to forget. Like, how do you imagine the Germans of the 6th century? Do you think they were all free and happy and prosperous warriors that were all together, united? My eyes, right? They had dramatically softened up themselves by certain standards, or some Germanic peoples. Not surprisingly, the ones that eventually waned the earliest were taken over by other peoples who had a terribly narrow but equally rich nobility and the rest of the freemen had dramatically impoverished. We know it archaeologically, for example, the Gepids. Why did the Longbirds defeat them? Because instead we see in the Longobird graves that the average warrior was still very well equipped. They had lots of swords, and they did look fit in that kind of middle core of the bulk of the people. So when you look at the ethnic shift in the Roman army, you look at this provincialization and the necessity also of serving itself of foreign troops. Think about the Summacari. I made a video about them and the early troops from Septimius, from Severian times. And there is also a need to adapt the same Roman army to the challenges posed by the barbarians, right? But this is mostly a doctrinal, technical thing, and so the Constantinian army was able also to crush the Sasanians, the Alemanni, etc. Because in part they had motivated their tactics, and or the Roman ones were still were thought to specifically cope with the one of those people successfully. But from the other side, you see, yes, in the Roman Empire, people abandoning this kind of military lifestyle in the process, but also those other border peoples that were living either outside or inside the limits that wanted to come living in the Roman Empire because they didn't want to be roaming war bands, always risking their life here and there. They wanted stability. These peoples wanted to find a place where they could dwell and stop, just having that militaristic, obsessive existence, because they could be wiped out from a moment to another by the next avalanche of peoples. They wanted to find like a more stable, secure area where they could consolidate their power. And when they did, the freemen lost their great part of their liberty as well, right? And greater leaders emerged. I mean, German kingship is a Roman creation. The Germans were atrociously opposed to any form of monarchy, exactly because they wanted to maintain this kind of just individual liberty, devoid of any ingerence, right? Of any, let's say, waning of the spirit of independence, etc. What does happen to the Franks or to the Goths when they settle in the Western Roman Empire? They stratify, right? That happens. The freemen lose force. The same Goths, especially, were the most Romanized of the Germans, had been properly compacted politically by Constantinople. Their leaders had been raised in the imperial palace at court. They had a completely different mindset from, say, Tacitus Germans, like living like as a true prehistoric people, right, in the wilderness. And that was really so. Tacitus was not an ideologue, right? He was not. We radically underestimate the sheer amount of brutality and primitiveness of that word, Romans included, right? So again, the ethno-nationalistic, frustrated individual that doesn't like to read Tacitus because it says that the Germans were basically a bunch of savages. Well, we were all a bunch of savages at the time, one way or another, right? And that's not the point. It's you who reason like an idiot in reverse, in modernistic, secularistic terms. You don't need skyscrapers to be a moral individual, right? And if you know anything about Germanistics, you should first of all be, light up a candle every day for Tacitus for having written what he did in the first place and thank him till the rest of your life. And secondly, realize that, of course, the Romans had actually a positive bias towards the Germans because they saw in them essentially their same ideal and creed that had once made Rome great from a moral point of view. Of course, the Germanic reality was vicious, but also the initial Roman one was, in a way. It's just the political compaction made the difference. the Germans didn't take over the world, the Romans did, but the initiation, the dynamic that brought them to rule was in a way the same, right? It was also in different times, different era, right? The world ages, and we will never have kind of Rome again, because that was that time in history, and things have kind of diluted and worsened, and for that kind of unity to be possible, right, it's been spoiled, right? It seems to us that just we live better because of material reasons, but morally we don't live better. In many ways, we don't fulfill our human potential like before. But this is the kind of challenge that I pose you, right? To be able to accept that you're not better than a person living 2,000 years ago. You just are not, because you pretend to say that you own any merit, or you are owed something because of what you have today. And what did you actually do to have what we have today? Like, did you invent airplanes? Did you build skyscrapers? Did you create the internet? What do you actually do? Because if we were to analyze what you do individually every day, you surely don't earn what you consume easily. There's somebody else providing it for you. And you're essentially that kind of tectonic mass that would go under over the ages, as we are, or somebody else ruling them. At the time, like, they had a degree of control on reality that you cannot even dream of. Like, do you have an idea of the sheer complexity of thought that is needed to be, I don't know, a 7th century Bulgar horseman? What it means to lead a herd, or, you know, an armed retinue, to know the land, to know the weather, to understand the intricacies of the political instability of the time, and surviving in it. Like, by magnitudinal scale, you're of a dramatically smaller brain than those people. But by far, simply, again, there is nothing about what you do every day that it is minimally comparable to that. Even if you are a professionist in something, like, you are, just because there is all a preset, prepared environment where you can do something extremely specific that has nothing to do with the world that allows you to do it. Those people molded the world in their image. You're not even capable of thinking that. This is crucial, again. We can't be... It's tiring, it's hard. It was hard, dramatically harder to live, but that was the point. They had the means to keep themselves awake, even though they were for the bad reasons, but they expanded their own humanity to boundaries that we can't even imagine today anymore. So the Romans themselves tried to cope with this loss of commitment. For example, the expedient was to oblige certain categories of people to the military service, essentially. For example, the children of the veterans, right? Those also who didn't have a real occupation, which seems pretty fair. Like, you find some, drifter or strange, shady guys, involved in small criminal or bigger criminality, whatever. You simply kidnap them, you put them in a barrack, you break their face every time they think they can't even afford to dream to think that they have a personal opinion, and you turn them into serial killers that you perfectly employ in the army. The same gentiles. So these outside peoples that were already serial killers, because that's the entire thing that these cultures were beyond the limits, just ravaging, pillaging, raping, exterminating, enslaving, right? That's, again, all what they did. They were welcomed within the empire. Some of them were brought down, meaning that, if you had literally defeated them and they were basically negotiating to this, okay, just do whatever you want of us, just give us some place to live, it would be brought in some, dispersed in some farming areas. There would be integrate in this kind of social fabric. Others would be enlisted, the most fit, right, the youngest, the strongest, etc., in the army, in the aforementioned method. They really didn't have much of an option at that point. The other version was, if they had the upper hand locally, you simply gave them some place where to go autonomously. They would regulate the matter again, as they had always done, because they did the same thing with each other in the most brutal ways, and they would provide you with those same troops. And just you wouldn't control the land and the people there, but they would give you something every once in a while, or at least it was mostly the army service, which was enough considering the times, and they would also defend the land from other peoples around. And they would naturally commit themselves and together with their children to pick up arms, right? This was a successful business because, again, that's the only thing that they kind of knew how to do, right? These peoples, again, how do you integrate somebody that just kills for a living? That the entire mindset and cosmology revolves around the eternal doctrine of struggle and victory. These people kind of want to fight, because also, again, going in the army is not that bad after all. It's surely better to what they were habituated, and as we've seen, also the lands they occupied very often were pretty crappy ones. So what would they do, right? Some would probably change life, of course, but others would want to go in the army. They had perspective of looting and continuing with their own violent lifestyle, etc. And then just maybe later on, when they made enough riches, maybe they wanted, to settle down with a farm, and then their children would, be raised with other people around who were Romans or Romanized, and so they were a bit less warlike, and so over the generations they would dilute themselves. Like 200 years later, they were just colonists under a Romano-Germanic lord. Right. So that this started episodically as small groups, normally, right? This had been the normal traffic size of the earlier centuries. They crossed the limes, profiting of its relative openness and fluidity, and they would, and the Roman authorities were okay because if these people didn't create particular problems, like they didn't devastate areas, etc., you could simply settle in the ones they chose, and they would be the next subjects. And there was plenty of these peoples also later on. For example, even after the Constitutio Antoniniana, this was true, right? There were lots of, like, the condition there was you had to speak Latin, whatever, but there were lots of peoples who were in the frontiers, who were Roman subjects since ever, but they weren't quite Romanized. They had kept living in pretty wild ways, as we were saying before. So then prisoners of war, then entire subjugated tribes, and so they kept doing this until entire barbarian populations were federated and transformed in kind of border polities to control. Because at that point also, what's the actual difference? Well, it was all more gradual than we think. Right, again, especially after, up to Adrianople. Right, after Adrianople, it was really the big watershed turning point. But even in there, as we were saying before, it's not because the Visigoths could not be taken out at different moments. It's just the same Romans, because of their own internal political affairs, would prefer not to. Or at some point they wouldn't or couldn't, right? Surely initially they couldn't. They would have done definitely better without. But again, as we were saying with Stilicho, the Visigoths became a pawn in the war between de facto the western and eastern half, or something more similar to a conflict. But still, by the 60s of the 5th century, Majoranus was to basically resettle the Visigoths from Spain somewhere else in the empire, because they surrendered to Rome. If the Vandals had not stood in the middle, there would have not been Visigoths in Spain. So the massive emission of Germanic elements within the Roman army, after experiments that had already occurred, for example, under Marcus Aurelius with the Jazyges, if you prefer, that were Iranians, by the way, were not Germans, albeit surely they were mixed. They dwelled in this corridor between Dacia and the Middle Danube, Pannonia on the other side, or this corridor, the Sarmatian peoples that they launched offensives around this frontier, across this frontier, etc. Was surely increasing at the time of the 3rd century, the beginning of the 3rd century. The Soldatenkaiser are so called not just because they were coming from the barracks, but because they were in part a bit barbarian themselves. Think about Maximinus the Thracian. He probably came from those, again, populations having lived for centuries under Rome, but not being quite fully Romanized. And so to the eyes of the civilized Roman, these were still barbarians, even though they were Roman subjects from within the frontiers. We know that Germanic and Gothic federati, and yes, they are two different things by a certain degree, were present in the unlucky Persian campaign of Gordon III, and in fact they are remembered in the celebrative inscription of King Shapur I to say, look, we capture all these guys. And the reason why I say that the Germans and the Goths were different is that, okay, I think I made lots of videos about the Goths and I explained these things, but to make the long story short, aside from the Traditionskern that these peoples had properly and probably from Scandinavia, what these had become by the 3rd, 4th century, by dwelling in Eastern Europe, etc., with other people, was something very different. But always remember, politics is all, right? You're not more Germanic to be a Goth than, being Italic by being a Roman, right? And people instead believe, oh no, these guys were ethnic Swedes that came to, no, right? They weren't. They were largely, aside from the fact that also, the big bulk of the Germans was actually from the continent, right? It's not that Scandinavia was actually the place from which the mass of what we call the Germans actually came from. The Germans came from the east, like all the Indo-European peoples, and Vaudenism and probably that kind of militaristic hardcore culture developed in the continent just to go eventually in Scandinavia. The Goths were mixed with lots of other peoples, Sarmatians, Huns, Proto-Slavs, even, Celto-Romanic populations, Greeks, you name them. I mean, of course, you can say that, generally speaking, they were kind of Germanoid, culturally speaking, kind of, right? And that most of the Gothic historiographic most Gothic identity was made up historiographically by the Romans in the 6th century after a great process of saying Romanization, etc. We know very few about where the Goths came from. I believe that the original nucleus came from Scandinavia. I mean, it's likely. But what the original nucleus demographically, ethnically speaking, had to do with the later people has, nobody knows, first of all, because there is no single historical, archaeological, or whatever evidence that can make you say anything like that. But there is not even reason to be obsessed with this idea, right? Because if you are obsessed with such narrow things, it's like you have that kind of small brain that I was talking about before. And you basically haven't understood anything about European history in the first place, and in the very hardcore nature of its identity, ethnically and culturally. That's why we also talk about the Germans, were another thing, like especially the ones of the West, the one of the Elbe, for which we know also they came likely, again, from the original nuclei from Scandinavia. With Claudius II and with Aurelian, and then ever more vorticously, let's say during the 4th century, as you know, the process of Germanic admixture, especially in the Roman army, increased. And there is no doubt that in this also the precise will of the emperors of provincial origin waned. As we were saying in that video about Maximinus' tracks, there was probably another mindset that the 3rd century emperors, often the one of the crisis, not just the Illyrian ones, but they were mostly that, had towards the empire. In a sense, they were more archaically conservative about this idea of the religious military privilege of the empire. That was true also because they were closer to the same peoples that lived across the Limes. That is to say, were more warlike, they understood more what it meant to fight. Why the Illyrian emperors? Because in the Illyricum, they weren't really Illyrian, by the way, from an ethnic point of view. They were mostly kind of various ethnicities. Telling the truth, the areas of Singidunum, Cernum, those were settled by Celts originally, right? But there had already been some blending, by the way. But this was the point, right? It was this tendential nature to accept a military lifestyle and the implication of action and moral force was more alive among these primitive peoples than in the other system. And of course, these peoples were not able eventually to take over the empire, but they still managed to save it from destruction, which is quite relevant, right? And they were using an army also made up of not just by these peoples, but importantly so. But I mean, everyone in the army was somebody capable of dying and fighting, right? The important is the degree in a sense, but if you are at that point, it's already great. And of course, the Roman army didn't really provide with, people who would flee in front of enemies. Like at Adrianople, it was mostly for example, the chain of command was crippled. And maybe it's the elites who were gentrifying in a sense, but something very rare in pitched battles is that the Roman army, when the chain collapsed, fought to the freaking death while surrounded by the Goths, right? And we often don't count this, but do you think the Germans didn't lost less troops than the Romans at Teutoburg? Because honestly, we think that of course, like a Germanic life was much less valuable than a Roman one at that point, and so it was a massive victory for the Germans. But do you really think that it was just Romans being butchered? Again, quite likely the Germans suffered more losses than the Romans in that battle, especially because the legionnaires had to fight to the death, and that's not something that you want to test yourself directly against. But again, you see, all the popular perspectives and bias on these topics seem to be reversed. And people don't even question this anymore. It becomes a meme. It becomes a way to vent personal frustrations, etc. Not a historical point, because it's not a moral point, as it's not a scientific point. That same darkness falls on ourselves today because we are weakening from that point of view. We don't actually even know history better in relative terms at all, because you cannot know history if you're weak easily. So, as we were saying before, the demand of warriors, especially Germanic ones, met happily with an interested offer. Again, the Romans needed these guys. These guys were, eager to be integrated in the business, in the system. And so if for the Roman citizens of old or even new date, military service was something onerous, or even in late empire, not particularly honorable, which was the contrary of the origins, among the Germans, as we know, a very different tradition was still alive, right? Bearing arms was not only an honor, but a sign of freedom, right? It was in the same medieval chivalry, the cingulum militaris. That was what distinguished, in fact, in Roman culture, the military from the rest of the people was not a uniform. It was the fact that in the first place these people bore arms. So for the youngsters beyond the limits, and also and especially for the noblemen, because again, as we were saying before, also the Germans were beginning to create kings to control in a more kind of oligarchic sense, and so also the average tribesman was kind of crippled in his liberty possibilities. Serving a prestigious leader in war was, and we know it since Tacitus, was a matter of pride. And which leader was more prestigious, after all, than the Augustus of Rome? This is what we have to think about. It's not, the Romans versus Germans, this divide, the racial difference. For a Germanic warrior, serving the world ruler was the greatest pride possibly imaginable, right? The Roman military insignia in the late Roman army, as we know, are effigiated in many monuments and even reproduced in the Notitia Dignitatum, about which we made a video, demonstrate which exceptional barbarian sample was present within those ranks. We find spiral-like animals and crowns hired on poles that are typical of the Reitervölker, right? And they have to do with this, again, domination of the Uranic on the Chthonic that corresponds to the leader and the retinue, and much more, actually. The Dracones, for example, were characteristic already of Parthian cavalry, because that was yet another Iranian people, just like the Sarmatians originally. And for example, there is the Celtic solar wheel, the Germanic runic symbols, the Illyrian solar disk. Again, it's all the entire universal tradition of solar symbolism. It's Augustus Apollo. It's the Evangelion of the solar deity that has to come to defeat the darkness and to restore the golden age. Rome had achieved that by far, and everybody can participate by saying, we are that too. We believe in this too. We are loaded like that. We have to demonstrate that, and this higher Lord will reward us. The Lordship. If you wonder why it's so massively and radically important in Western military culture, even the same military Christianity, the power of the Lord, the glory to Christ. This is the entire reason. It was about, again, in the European tradition, the Lord, the child that has to restore the golden age, is born to save the world, fundamentally. It's the same one of Christianity. They were all the same thing. It's not that Christianity copied that. That was present already in the background previous to Christianity, from which Christianity emanated. They were believing all the same entire thing. The entire Romano-Germanic world was obsessed with the living force of this, whereas the Byzantines kind of sclerotized this in a divide between the ruler that is absconditus in a sense, and the order is rigid. Instead, this West was striving with these forces, with these war bands, that were still brought under powerful forces, whether Roman emperors or Germanic leaders, etc. They were still testing each other, muscle to muscle, in open field, against each other, one on the side of the other. They were crucial. Some of the finest Germanic or Celtic forces that the Romans had. Think about the Battle of Strasbourg against the Alemanni. The Auxilia Palatina saved the Roman army. But these people were, abusively proud of their own military prestige, because they were loaded with these ideas, and the Romans were in the same way. So the continuous repetition of solar symbols corresponded surely to the emperor's will. Consider that the Sol Invictus was not just a personal protector of the emperors and of the army, but it was named in fact a comes, like the same one of the comitatus. The idea of this brotherhoods of warriors that were all one for their leader, were fanatically faithful, loyal to the creed, to the spirit accord, to their chieftain that they would have done everything for. And in these war bands, as you know, every once in a while somebody was taken out to remember that their life didn't belong to them anymore. They were just initiates that were disposed of by the deity that possessed them. So doing less than the leader meant to be nothing, and to prefer death to it. Could extend this concept because the scale of this loyalty was not properly ethnic. It was measured in civilizational terms. The other day we were talking about the Scot-Gaelic warfare in the same time, the late Empire. The clan Caladan, the idea that there were some Irish war bands that had been trained in the Roman army and that Cuchulainn also fights against, and there are certain scenes which probably there was probably this sense of unity of these enemies, of these forces in combat, uniform drill, etc., that reflects that scale of power that the Roman training standards, military speaking, were simply the top existing ones at the time. So again, even for a Germanic ruler, you don't see the ethnic difference here. Consider the prestige that derives from owning that military expertise that only a professional, permanent armored force can provide you with, right? These Germanic peoples, as you know, they didn't have the same amount of collective discipline as the Romans did. They were in many ways a very tough nut to crack, but they were limited in many ways as well. And why? Because they were still not kind of a civilization like the Romans were. But they were gapping the difference there, because they were essentially being schooled by the Romans and equipped by the Romans and trained by the Romans, and they were fighting like them. And they eventually managed to take over the West in the process. And we know that Clovis had his own Roman legionary forces together with him in his Frankish army that were revered and that constituted communities within the Frankish kingdom that everybody could say, those are Romans, those are sons of legionnaires. They had all a cult revolving around their insignia, their tradition. Eventually they got lost in the mists of the early Middle Ages, but they were again revered within the same Romano-Germanic system. We'll make videos about that, by the way. So this monarchic sacred concept is the core of it all. You need a higher power. And that's why the Germanic powers are actually imitating Rome. They're becoming monarchies. They're becoming kingdoms that takes a lot of strength to put together, because the various clans do not want to know that, but they are also forced by the events, by the metus hostilus, by the necessity of the migration that require a centralized command. The Germans were okay with that as long as the emergential situation was temporary, so they normally elected, also in ancient times, a leader for war, but after that it was over, the mandate was over. This situation is wearing out even probably the same Germanic middle classes to a certain degree. The oligarchs organize the army, need to manage the supplies. When they settle in the Roman army, they take the reins of the administration. They rule it as they can for what is left and for what they could understand. But they had Roman administrators, clerics working for them, and They had resources. They had very often at some point, some entire areas that were also kind of more productive, especially when they push strongly after the 5th century. They have the means and the resources to centralize for those time standards and to afford this kind of military power, right? More refined, more professional. This is the base of the same feudal cavalry, the great latifundi of gold that were relatively untouched from Roman times, that they will fuel the Merovingian and Carolingian armed mounted retinues that had a semi-professional, if not professional nature at the end. And the average freeman, Roman or Germanic alike, would sink in that process. So the imperial cult served as a unifying measure to the tradition of the single peoples. And this is crucial. There was only one possible universal power, and they wanted all to partake it. And it's also not a surprise in these terms that by the 4th century, in spoken Latin, the terms miles and barbarus de facto overlapped. And this happened also in other times in the past, right? The idea that, for example, think about the 14th century with just 1,000 years later, with the contraction of Eurasia because of the plague, the refeudalization, the real oligarchization of powers, the middle classes go down, the kings strengthened, the princes mostly strengthened their own power locally, and lots of peoples there is a upheaval. Some military classes are dispossessed, they have to go fight abroad, a bit like during the migration era, they had to leave their land, etc. They are hired, there are lots of mercenaries, there is an internationalization of military culture. I made a video about this just recently, about the ethnic, moral, and cultural background of the late medieval, early modern mercenaries, and they blended in together a truly European culture, because they all pursue, and they were foreigner mostly. So that's the average soldier was considered to be, this guy comes from somewhere else, right? So the miles, the soldier, and barbarus are the same. Albeit, as we were saying before, however, as long as a Roman state existed, the bulk of the army was Roman, also de facto ethnically. Doesn't matter how mixed ethnically the Roman Empire was, especially the Byzantine one in the east, even in the west, was much less. It was essentially either you were Italic or Celtic or Germanic. There weren't other options. Just North Africa, you could be Berber in part, but also the Roman presence there had been mostly coastal by a certain degree, except for Tunisia, so the Africa. But the idea is that the soldier, the military professional, is just essentially a dispossessed guy that just goes for war, right? We find it, I don't know, even at the end of the Hellenic classical times, when the Macedonians take over. They are empires, de facto, take over the various polis. And about the Hellenic classical hoplite, we know he was kind of peasant soldier, and citizen, etc. We also are, for that reason, much more documented, because they were the same people participating to politics, etc. Macedonian and Hellenistic times, they are even later, but we know nothing about that, because the Macedonian phalangites were the scum of the earth, were fundamentally barbarians, proletarians, hired in the army for loot, for the professionalism of these great monarchs, etc. And so everything changes. So you see that the comparison that happens, and so the multi-ethnicity also of this army was there, but not again in a kind of fragmenting factor anymore. Actually, at this point, given that was still the need to keep things together and to rebuild again what had been lost throughout all these upheavals, a synthesis capacity. And from this synthesis capacity, we see most of what Western Europe actually became. And this is crucial. And this, I think, is one of the most important intuitions you can think about the Roman army. in for the time being. Okay, I'm out of voice, by the way, because I thought this video would be small instead it wasn't. But in any case, I stop it here. We'll keep talking about these topics, hopefully, and just for today, it's all. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.